A woman finds herself in an unusual situation when her husband's nephew visits for the night. What begins as an innocent game turns into a night filled with unexpected emotions and personal revelations. She confronts choices about loyalty, personal boundaries, and trust in relationships. The events of one evening lead to a surprising twist that changes her perspective on her marriage forever. Hi everyone, welcome back. Thanks for joining us today. We've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. It was just an ordinary evening, or so I thought. The kind of night where you settle in, enjoy a little peace, and let the world fade into the background. But as soon as I walked into the living room, everything shifted. My husband sitting on the couch with a strange, almost distant look on his face, casually mentioned that his nephew would be staying over. Nothing unusual there, he often visits. What followed, however, would leave me questioning everything. I noticed something different in the air, a tension I couldn't quite put my finger on. As his nephew, Alex, settled in for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the atmosphere had changed. The way my husband looked at me, then at his nephew, was unsettling. I tried to shrug it off. After all, Alex was family, and he'd always been a friendly, harmless kid. But something about tonight didn't sit right. As the evening wore on, the lines between what was acceptable and what wasn't began to blur. I tried to focus on the TV, but every now and then, I caught Alex looking at me in a way I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just a glance. It was something deeper, something that made me feel uneasy. And the way my husband acted as if everything was perfectly normal only added to the confusion. I told myself I was overthinking it, but as the night stretched on, my discomfort only grew. When my husband casually said, "You can play with Alex for a while. He needs someone to keep him company," I wasn't sure what he meant. Was he encouraging something I didn't understand? What did he mean by play? Was this a game or something else entirely? The hours ticked by, and I couldn't help but wonder, what did my husband really want from me? And why was I starting to feel trapped in a situation I didn't fully understand? I couldn't ignore it any longer. And that's when things took a turn I never saw coming. As I sat there, trying to understand the odd situation, my mind was racing. What exactly was my husband thinking? He had always been a quiet man, a bit reserved, but never one to keep things from me. At least, not until now. He and Alex were close, sure. They'd always had a special bond, but I had never felt like an outsider before. There was always room for me in their world, or at least that's how it had always seemed. I decided to push my doubts aside for a while and just focus on the evening. I thought I could laugh it off. Maybe engage with Alex the way I had many times before. But this time, it was different. Alex seemed more mature than I remembered, his gaze intense, as if he was carefully studying me. It was unsettling. I tried to make small talk, asking him how school was going, what he had been up to lately. But every answer seemed to have an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place. The silence in the room grew heavier with each passing minute. My husband, now reclining on the couch, didn't seem bothered by the tension at all. In fact, he seemed almost indifferent. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, but the more I observed, the more I felt like there was a hidden layer to everything happening that night. Eventually, Alex asked if I wanted to play a game. It was innocent enough, or so I thought. "Sure," I said, trying to sound upbeat, but something about his tone made me second-guess myself. As we set up the game, my husband gave me a quick glance, one that made my stomach twist. He didn't say anything, but there was something in his eyes that made it clear he was expecting something. The tension between us was thickening, and I had no idea how to break it. We sat down, and the game began. It was supposed to be fun, a way to pass the time, but instead it felt like I was playing into something I didn't understand. Alex's questions started to feel strange, too personal, too pointed. They weren't the kinds of questions a nephew usually asks an aunt, and every time I gave a short answer or tried to redirect the conversation, my husband just smiled, as though everything was perfectly fine. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being manipulated in some way. But how? Why? And most importantly, what did my husband know that I didn't? As the night dragged on, my mind was spinning, trying to piece together what was happening. But the more I thought, the less sense it made. The game continued, but it felt less like fun and more like a silent test I wasn't prepared for. Alex had an odd way of making simple questions seem like challenges. He'd ask about things I had never mentioned, questions that seemed to be probing into my past, things I didn't feel comfortable talking about. It wasn't just curiosity. It felt deliberate, like he was searching for something. I could feel the tension growing between us, a heavy weight that I couldn't explain. Every time I gave a vague or evasive answer, Alex would smile knowingly, as though he had already figured me out. His gaze never left me, even when I tried to focus on the game or look away. I couldn't escape that feeling of being under scrutiny, and the more I tried to distance myself from it, the more it seemed to pull me in. I glanced over at my husband, hoping to catch his eye, to find some sign that he was aware of the discomfort I was feeling. But he didn't seem to notice. His attention was fixed on his phone, scrolling through something, as if completely oblivious to the tension in the room. Was he really that absorbed, or was he pretending not to see? I couldn't tell. It wasn't just Alex's questions that bothered me. It was the way he spoke. His tone was too mature for his age, too calculated. There was something unsettling about how he mirrored my own gestures, as if he was trying to match me, to get inside my head. I didn't know what was worse, the questions or the unsettling feeling that every move I made was being observed, dissected. Then there was the silence. It stretched out between us like a chasm. Every moment felt like it was pushing me farther from the woman I thought I was, and into some unfamiliar space where the rules didn't make sense anymore. I thought about leaving the room, about escaping into the kitchen, but I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter where I went, I'd still be trapped. Alex stood up suddenly, his chair scraping the floor loudly, breaking my thoughts. "I'm getting tired," he said in a voice that seemed too grown up for his age. He stretched his arms, and the moment he sat back down, his eyes met mine again. There was something in that look, something that made me wonder just how much he knew, and why my husband had said nothing. I felt a rising panic in my chest, but I couldn't let it show. What had started as a seemingly normal night was turning into something far more sinister, and I still had no idea why. All I knew was that the longer I stayed, the more I felt like I was losing control. The clock ticked loudly in the background, each second making the air feel thicker. I tried to brush off the unease creeping up my spine, but it was becoming impossible to ignore. Alex had returned to his seat, but his energy had shifted. He was no longer the carefree nephew I had known. He was more like an actor playing a part, a role that didn't quite fit the character he was supposed to be. His eyes were constantly on me, following my every move with an intensity that was unnerving. I caught myself glancing at my husband again, hoping for some kind of reassurance, but he was still engrossed in his phone, barely even acknowledging the tension between Alex and me. I couldn't tell if he was truly unaware or if he was deliberately turning a blind eye to what was happening in front of him. That thought sent a chill down my spine. What if he was part of it? What if he knew something I didn't? Alex broke the silence again, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "Auntie, do you ever wonder what would happen if we didn't play by the rules?" he asked, his words hanging in the air like a puzzle I couldn't solve. My heart skipped a beat. What kind of question was that? It didn't make sense. I forced a smile, trying to keep my composure, but his gaze didn't waver. "No," I said quickly, my voice sounding more nervous than I wanted it to. "I think I'm happy just following the rules." Alex tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "But what if the rules are wrong? What if there's another way?" His words were soft, but the weight they carried felt unbearable. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what was going on, but it felt like the pieces of the puzzle just wouldn't fit together. I stood up, needing to move, needing to escape this suffocating conversation. I walked to the window and stared out into the night, but the cold air didn't help. I could feel Alex's presence behind me, even though I couldn't see him. It was as if he was waiting for something, or maybe even pushing me towards something I wasn't ready to face. "Why don't you come back and sit down, Auntie?" Alex's voice came from behind me, soft but demanding. I turned around to find him standing too close, his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. But before I could react, my husband's voice broke through the tension. "Everything okay?" he asked, as if nothing was wrong, as if I wasn't standing there, trapped between his nephew's unsettling gaze and his own disinterest. My pulse raced, and the weight of the moment hit me all at once. Something wasn't right. I didn't know what it was yet, but I had to find out. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself as I faced my husband, but the calmness in his voice only made the situation more unsettling. The way he spoke, as if everything was perfectly normal, made me question my own sanity. "Everything's fine," I replied, my voice coming out shakier than I intended. I turned back to Alex, who was now sitting quietly, his eyes fixed on me, the silence between us growing more intense by the second. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to snap. Why was I so uncomfortable around Alex all of a sudden? What had changed in him? And why wasn't my husband seeing it? It was as if they were both in on something, and I was the only one left out of the loop. I tried to focus on my husband, but his phone buzzed in his hand, pulling his attention away from me once again. He checked the message, his face unreadable. For a moment, I thought about asking him who it was, but the words caught in my throat. Something told me that whatever was happening here, whatever had been happening all night, was too important for him to explain. Alex stood up suddenly, breaking my thoughts. His movements were fluid, too calm for someone his age. Without saying a word, he walked over to me and stopped just a few inches away. I could feel his breath on my skin, and for the first time, I felt a real sense of danger. This was no longer just a strange evening. This was something else entirely. "Are you sure you want to know the truth?" Alex asked, his voice low but piercing. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity I couldn't escape. It was as if he knew everything about me, everything I had ever tried to hide. My skin crawled. "What truth?" I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. Alex smiled faintly, an eerie glint in his eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a piece of paper folded neatly. He held it out to me, and before I could reach for it, he quickly tucked it back into his pocket. "You'll understand soon enough," he said cryptically, his voice barely above a whisper. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to process what had just happened. What was on that piece of paper, and why did he want me to see it? Before I could ask, my husband finally looked up from his phone. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "What did he say?" he asked, his voice tight. But there was something in his tone, something desperate, that made my heart sink. It was as if he already knew what was about to unfold, and he was terrified. I stared at him, unable to speak. I had no idea what was going on, but I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. Whatever was happening, it was much bigger than just a game. And I was about to be drawn into something I couldn't even begin to understand. The room felt suffocating as my husband's eyes flickered with panic. "What did he say?" he repeated, his voice thin with a fear I'd never heard before. I was shaking now, too terrified to speak, but the weight of Alex's gaze was still on me, like he was daring me to figure it out. My mind raced, but it was as if all the pieces were just out of reach. Alex took a step back and looked at me with a calmness that was almost eerie. "Don't worry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You'll understand everything in time." And then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with my husband. I stared at the door, my heart pounding in my chest. What had just happened? What was this truth Alex kept talking about? And why had my husband not intervened, not once, when I had felt so out of place? The questions flooded my mind, but the answers eluded me. Then, in a blur, my husband stood up. The phone in his hand dropped to the floor with a sharp crack. His face was a picture of terror now, and I saw something in his eyes, a mixture of regret and fear that chilled me to my core. "You have to know," he said, his voice cracking. "I never wanted this for you." I felt my throat tighten. "Wanted what?" I whispered. He hesitated, taking a step toward me. "Alex isn't just my nephew. He's something else, something I should have told you long ago." His voice faltered. "I thought I could keep you safe, but it was never about me protecting you. It was about him." Confusion gripped me. "What do you mean?" "Alex is not human. He never was. He's part of something ancient, something that's been passed down through generations. I tried to keep you away from it, but it was always going to find you." My husband's words hung in the air, heavy and surreal. "You were always the target from the moment we met." My blood ran cold. My hands trembled as I stared at him. "So, everything was a lie?" He nodded, his eyes filled with tears now. "I didn't know how to protect you from it. I thought you were safe. But the truth is, he's been watching you all along. The paper Alex had, it's your inheritance. He was meant to bring you into his world." Before I could respond, the room seemed to grow darker, the air thicker. A shadow moved at the edge of my vision, and I whipped around to see Alex standing in the doorway again. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and I realized with horror that I wasn't the one trapped in this house. It was my husband, and now it was too late for all of us. The room felt suffocating, and every breath I took seemed to echo in my ears. My mind was racing, trying to process what my husband had just revealed, but none of it made sense. Alex wasn't human? What did that even mean? And why hadn't he told me the truth sooner? My heart felt heavy with a mix of betrayal and confusion, as if the ground beneath me was shifting. Alex stepped into the room, his presence overwhelming. His glowing eyes locked onto mine, and for a brief moment, I saw something that wasn't just eerie. It was ancient. He smiled, a smile that sent shivers down my spine, and I realized, with a sinking feeling, that this wasn't just a family secret. This was something far bigger, something that had been unfolding long before I had ever met my husband. "You don't understand yet," Alex said, his voice calm but chilling. "But you will. You're part of something far older than this world, and I'm the one who's been chosen to bring you into it." I took a step back, feeling the walls closing in. "Chosen for what? What do you want from me?" He tilted his head as if amused by my confusion. "It's not what I want. It's what you're meant for. You were always meant to join us." I turned to my husband, searching for some sign of reassurance, some sign that this was a nightmare I would wake from. But his face was pale, his eyes wide with regret. "I couldn't stop it," he whispered. "I thought I could protect you. I thought if I kept you in the dark, it would never come for you. But Alex, he's always been here, watching you, waiting for the right time." The weight of his words crashed into me, and I felt my knees weaken. What had I gotten myself into? How could I have missed all the signs? My whole life felt like a lie now, and the truth, as horrifying as it was finally in front of me. I was part of something dangerous, something beyond human understanding, and I couldn't escape it. Alex took another step closer. "You don't have a choice," he said softly. "It's already begun. You've been marked." My mind screamed for a way out, for a solution that could undo the nightmare unfolding before me. But the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. There was no escape. I wasn't just a bystander. I was the target, the key, and now I had been caught in their web. But then something unexpected happened. My husband, who had been silent all this time, stepped forward. There was something different in his eyes now, something almost resigned. He reached out to me, his hand trembling. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I wanted to protect you. I didn't know how to stop it, but you have to understand." Before he could finish, Alex's face twisted into a dark smirk. "It's too late for apologies," he said, his voice cold. "You can't protect her anymore. She's already ours." I felt a strange, pulsing sensation rise within me, like an invisible force pulling me toward Alex. I wanted to fight it, to scream, but the words wouldn't come. My body felt like it was betraying me, inching closer to him, and there was nothing I could. And then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, everything shifted. The room went cold, and the shadows seemed to swallow the light. Alex's expression faltered for just a moment, confusion flickering across his face. That's when I realized it wasn't just me who had been marked. It was my husband, too. Both of us were bound by forces we couldn't control. But in that instant, I saw the truth in my husband's eyes. He wasn't just a victim of this curse. He had been part of it, willingly, for all these years. With a sudden surge of strength, I grabbed his hand. "We're in this together," I said, the words surprising even me. For the first time that night, I wasn't afraid. I understood that this was no longer about escaping. It was about breaking free from the hold they had on us. Alex lunged toward us, but before he could reach us, the ground beneath our feet cracked open, and a light brighter than anything I had ever seen filled the room. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought I saw the truth in its purest form. The truth of our lives, of who we were meant to be. But as quickly as it came, the light faded, and when I opened my eyes, Alex was gone. There was silence now, and as I looked at my husband, the weight of everything that had happened finally settled in. We had survived, but I knew that the shadows of that night would linger. Our world had changed, and we would never be the same again. In the end, the truth had been revealed, not just about Alex, but about the bond between my husband and me. The darkness may have been vanquished for now, but the journey wasn't over. The mysteries that had unraveled that night would echo through the rest of our lives, and there was no going back. But somehow, I had found strength in the unlikeliest of places, in the truth, no matter how terrifying it was.